And welcome back. We're now going to go ahead and get ready to add the ability to have input into our game. So for example, if we press left and right, our character will move left and right, up, down, etc. And the way we're going to handle this is going to be a little different than we've done in the past. And we're actually going to use a package that's in Unity. Let's go to our package manager here. And we're going to go ahead and search for the input system. So if I am again in the Unity registry, I search for input. You can see we now have the input system here. We're going ahead and install that into our game. And it should only take a few seconds here to install. And after it's done installing, you get this warning that says, hey, it's a new input syncs package, but the backends are not enabled. That's okay. We just need to enable backends, so we're just going to hit yes. And we just wait for Unity to go ahead and complete its restart process. All right, and so once Unity has gone ahead and finished that, we are now back at our package manager here. So now we can close our package manager. Now we can modify our prefab here several ways. Of course, we can click here on our prefab and go ahead and edit it, or I can go right to the player object here. I'm just going to collapse some of these pieces here so they're kind of out of the way. And we're going to go ahead and add our component. We're going to go to input, and we're going to see there's an option here for player input, so I can add that. And the important thing is, as we work on this, we have to just make sure that we eventually take our overrides here and we apply this back to the player prefab. So we'll just do that at the end here so that everything's all set up. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to click on Create Actions here, which is going to open up a window. You can see we have our folders here. And I'm just going to go ahead and do a new folder. And let's go ahead and call this one our Input System. So we're going to go ahead and name that Input System. And, of course, we can name what this is. So I can, of course, just keep this as is. Or I could have this something more specific. So, for example, I could call this, for example, like Input Actions or maybe Player Input. You know, you can give it a more appropriate name. We're going to make sure we save that inside of that folder that we just created because we don't want that outside here in our assets. Go ahead and click on Save. And if we look at our input system now, you can see there's that player input right there. You can see we also have this new window that has appeared. I'm actually going to just go ahead and move that here. And I'm going to dock that next to where the console was right now. Just for now, we can, of course, move that around later if we need to. And before I edit this, let's go ahead and just drag our player input here over to our actions. And we should, of course, get this to bind in here. And, of course, you can see we already have this in here, which is awesome. But if it was not, again, we can just simply drag and drop this on in here. It should match that. Now, we want to, of course, go ahead and look at our player input. So we have that open right here. And I'm actually going to go ahead. I'm going to move those up here now just so I can see this a little better. And you can see we have a couple actions predefined. So we have things like move, look, fire. If I open up move, for example, you can see there's a couple different things set up in here for already. So there's already some base movement applied. But remember, we're going to have other things such as jump. And to add those, I go to Actions. And you can see we get a new command here. So I'm just going to call this one Jump. So let's go ahead and add some bindings. So the first thing I'm going to do is in my first binding, let's go ahead and choose a keyboard and mouse binding. And we want to make sure that this binding, of course, is a button type, which it is. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to say, what path do I want to, where do I want to pull that from? So up here, I have some options. I can scroll through this. But since I have a keyboard literally in front of me, I can go ahead and click on Listen. I can tap whatever button on my keyboard I want to be jumped. So, for example, I'm going to do spacebar because that's a pretty common one. And you can see now we have the option here for space keyboard. So we're going to go ahead and click on that. And it now fills it in. Now, if I had, let's say, a controller, I can, of course, add another binding in here. And since I don't have a controller currently hooked up, I can just do gamepad. And in here, I can click on gamepad, and I can choose what button would that be. So, for example, we can say we want to do button south. And that would, of course, bind that to there. And you can see that we have other options in here. If we start looking at some other ones, you can see how those kind of start getting filled in. But we're going to go ahead and leave that one as is for now. All right, so I'm going to just kind of leave this as is. Let's quickly save, move this on over back to our scene. And let's open our input settings here. And right now we need to save these in an asset. So we're going to go ahead and create a settings asset. And you can see it showed up right here, input settings. Boom, that looks good. This is currently good as is for the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. Let's go ahead and move our input system into our input system folder, so that way that's in the proper location. And now we're going to go ahead and ready to add our script to our player, because of course we are going to need scripts in order to control this. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder here. Let's call this our scripts folder. And inside my scripts folder, let's go ahead now and create a new C# script. And I'm going to choose to call this one player input. Now I do have something already actually called player input, so I'm actually maybe call this one player movement, just because again we have something called player input. We don't want to necessarily confuse them, so that is just a way to help differentiate that. Now with our movement script there, let's go back to our player. let's drag that script in here so that way it's part of this player object. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag that on in. Boop, there it is. And I'll just close that sprites menu there. And one thing we need to do is we need to apply this back to our prefab. So we're going up here to our overrides. And you can see we have the override here for the player input and movement script. So I'm going to hit apply all, which means now if I were to go back and look at this prefab here, and I go ahead and look at it, you can see that it has those player input and movement script on it. So let's go ahead and get ready to code up our script. Now, because we are working with a slightly different thing here, we need to make sure we come in here, add a new using statement. So we want to use the Unity. All right, and what are we using? Well, we're using the input system here. So it's just Unity engine.input system, and that will add that script or that component that we had as part of this package here. Now, the first thing we have to do is we have to add a vector2 because we need to keep track of how our player is moving. And of course, that's pretty easy to do. We can just say vector2. And what is this vector2 going to be? Well, we have to simply give it a thing. So that's going to say this is our movement input, and that will help us keep track of that value. Now from here we're going to have to, of course, build out something that's going to have to be called, and so we're probably going to want to go ahead and create in here a method that we can access. So for example, I might have a private method called onMove. Now we need, of course, pass in a parameter here because we want to get values from the keyboard. So we're going to add in our input value here. And let's just give it a number called value. And what we want to do is store this back into movement input. So let's go ahead and make movement input. Let's go ahead and equal this value that we're trying to get. So we're going to make that value dot get. And we're going to use the brackets here. And what are we trying to pass in? Well, we're trying to pass in a vector2 because, again, that's the type that we're trying to refer back to here. Now, it's always good to be able to test to make sure our code's working because before we get too many things going here, let's add a quick debug statement in here that's going to allow us simply to keep track of what's actually happening. So let's just go ahead and print out our input movement here because, again, we want to just, again, keep track of what's actually happening in our game. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run the game. And let's see if we get some input here. So I'm going to make sure I'm clicked inside the game here. And look, we have input. So that is great. And again, that is a really quick and easy thing here because, again, we were just able to call this onMove value, which already exists within part of the input package. And so now we are ready to go ahead and expand this with some additional code.